So the last example in this lecture then is to create a triangle. This is a little bit more complicated than the previous one. So the previous one we had rows and columns, but they're essentially independent, right? So the number of rows and the number of columns is independent. If we're going to create a triangle, though, that's no longer the case. So to have a triangle of stars, we want to have a different number of stars in each row. So in the first row we have 1 star, in the second row we have 2, in the third row we have 3. So this is where the complication comes in, because, and this is unfortunately can be quite common in when we're running loops. Depending on which time we're around the outer loop, that determines how many times the inner loop runs. Okay, so the first time around the outer loop, we need the inner loop to run once. The second time, we need it to run twice. The third time, we need it to run 3 times. So in this case, if we know which row we're producing, we know how many stars are needed. Okay, so the only thing is that don't forget that this counter that we had for the rectangle, counter runs from 0. So for the third row, the variable row is set to 2. So for the third row, remember the row we got row 0, row 1, row 2. So for the third row, the row variable is set to 2. So the number of stars we want is now row plus 1. Okay, so the inner loop then is now is not just independent of the number of columns we're getting is not just independent. It's just not just what the user's typed in. It's dependent on the row number. So if row is, as I said, if row is 2, then we want 3 stars. Okay, so this col runs however many stars we want, as we saw. If for the third row, the variable row is set to 2, so the inner loop runs 3 times, which is 3 is 2 plus 1. Row is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, and the values of col are 0, 1, and 2. Okay. So then if we put that in our code, we then get this example. Okay, so we ask what size of triangle. It runs, the outer loop runs for how many rows they say, which is how many rows the user says, which is the size. So if they say 10, the size is going to be 10, it will get 10 rows. But the number of columns changes every time around. So this inner loop, the number of times the inner loop runs changes every time the user every time the loop runs. So each time around the loop, we've got a different number of columns. Okay, apart from that, the changes are minimal. So it's not really a big change from the previous examples. It's just that it's more complicated because we're changing this how many times the loop runs depending on where we are in the sequence of rows. Okay, let's just demonstrate that. What size triangle? Let's say a triangle size 3. You'll see you get 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars, and so on, and that will work for any value that I choose to put in, like 5. Okay, so slightly complicated example to finish off with there, but hopefully you've got the idea that loops are basically they're used whenever the code needs to repeat the same operation over and over again, and that's so common in programs that you find them everywhere. We've looked at for loops and while loops. As I said, for loops tend to be used when we know how many times the loop's going to run, and while tends to be used for while a condition is true. We've looked at the range function, which is used particularly for loops. So it's really, it can be used in other places because it just produces a sequence of numbers, but it's really common as one of the control elements for a for loop. We've seen the break and continue keywords. Those are not used that commonly, but they're very useful sometimes. So you need to know what they do. And it's really important to practice with these things to get the sense of how they work. So you need to practice both types of loop. You need to practice how the range function works and how loop counters work, and also nested loops. Although they're very simple examples of nested loops, actually nested loops are so common in lots of types of programming, like the things like games I mentioned, or just processing data. You use nested loops all the time. So you should be familiar with the idea of one loop running inside another, even if you're just working with these rather basic examples that are producing squares of text and rectangles and triangles and so on. Okay, thanks for listening, and next time we'll be looking at lists, which are kind of the data counterpart of loops. So loops control running the same piece of code over and again. Lists store the same, lots of the same type of data. So we can have a list of numbers or a list of strings or things like that. So we'll see that they're natural counterparts for each other. Okay, but that's for next time.